in this session, what we really want to do is talk about how we can better teach our students, and hopefully yourselves as well, if it doesn't completely make sense, on shutter speeds and apertures, and how to really utilize those and understand how to control them so that you get the pictures that you want. So we're going to do a couple of things here. This really is a live presentation. It is being recorded, so you'll be able to go back and watch it later. But it also means this is a great opportunity as we're going through this. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And we'll try to make sure that by the time we're done in the next 45 minutes or so, that you've got a lot of great information and hopefully some ideas of some things you can do to help make teaching about camera controls a little bit better. If you don't have your camera, whether it's a DSLR, whether it's an old film camera, even if it's your phone, grab that just so that you can reference that and some of the things that we're going to talk about this afternoon. And then I do want you to try and have, and you'll understand why, you want to have a couple of sheets of paper. And if they're paper with lines on them, that makes it a little bit easier for the exercise that we're going to do. But if you'll have a couple of sheets of paper with you, that you'll understand what I want you to do with those in just a few minutes. Any questions before we get started? And a good afternoon to you, Mr. Schmidt. It is good to see you, though. I'm missing the sheep, but I do appreciate the previous post with the picture of the sheep in the background. So, and Hal, feel free to jump in at any point in this conversation. You certainly have just as much knowledge and information about this. So if you found some things that you think would be a benefit to everybody, please don't hesitate to contribute that to the conversation.
Will do.
All right, so let me share my screen here. I'm just going to do the desktop. That's just safer. All right, and we're going to play. Everybody see that okay? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about camera handling, shutter speeds, apertures, and ISO, just sort of all the technical side of working with our cameras. And there's my email address. If you have questions and it's after the workshop is over, please feel free to email me and I will be glad to try and answer any questions that you have. Here's a really great quote that I think is something that sort of gets your students and hopefully you to think a little bit more. It was comment by Jay Dickman, who is a National Geographic photographer, lives up in Colorado, won a Pulitzer Prize when he was with the Dallas Times-Herald years ago. But he made this comment during a workshop last summer, and I thought it was really, it really summarizes what this session is about, because what our goal is to make that camera so that it's not an impediment in getting great pictures. And if we're struggling with the camera, if we don't understand the controls on that camera or how to use that camera, then it's just going to get in our way. It's one more thing that we have to think about in addition to aperture, in addition to composition and story and all the other things that you want your students to really understand. So it makes sense for you to make sure that they know about that camera and understand how to use it so that they can then go get the pictures that you want for your book. So a couple of camera handling basics, and I'm gonna, hopefully you can see me up here in the corner. Let's talk very briefly about our digital SLR here. There's a lot of different ways to use this camera, but one of the things that you really want to do and teach your students, it's one of my pet peeves, and it's one of the things that even to this day, after almost 55 years, I still give my dad a hard time when he's not holding the camera correctly. The goal is to make sure that this camera doesn't move while we're taking pictures, and that means providing some stability to it. So what you want to teach your students to do is to hold the camera correctly, and that's not holding it like this. It's not holding it like this. It's making sure that we support the weight of that camera in both of our hands. And so what we want to do is we want to take that left hand, we're going to hold it out in front of us. We're going to rest the camera in the palm of our hand so that our thumb and our finger are wrapped around the lens. And what that does is it now gives me control of the zoom. If I'm doing manual focus, it gives me control of the manual focus. And with that left hand sort of supporting the weight of the camera, it actually acts almost like a monopod. It provides much better stability for our camera when we hold it like that. And again, I've got all those lens controls right there at my fingertips with my left hand. With my right hand, I'm going to grab this lens or the side of the camera so that I've got access to the shutter release and all of my controls. But we've got this little thing here called a strap that we really want to make sure the students are using. Now, a lot of teachers like to insist that you put that camera around or that strap around your neck. I don't find that real comfortable. And so what I tend to do is I will take that strap and I'm going to wrap it around my wrist. And you'll notice it's wrapped twice here so that if I get bumped when I'm out taking pictures, especially at a football game or something like that, that camera's not going to hit the ground. It's still attached to my wrist. And the nice thing about this is that if I'm in a crowd or something and I'm photographing that group or that crowd and I need to be able to get my camera up higher, I'm not going to take my neck with it. Instead, I'm able to hold that camera up. There we go. You know, this is so much easier when we're live and in person. Hold that camera up above my head and still be able to provide some stability for it because of the way that I've got that strap wrapped around my wrist. And that just helps make sure that we're going to hold the camera correctly. In addition, if you're going to shoot vertically, all you need to do is to rotate my right hand. I'm not moving my left hand at all. I'm rotating my right hand so that I'm still supporting the weight of the camera in my left hand, but I still have access to all my controls with my right hand. And by using it like this, it forces you to pull your arm in tight to your body when you're holding the camera and when you're taking pictures. And that again is just going to provide more stability. So you really do want to make sure that you start your instruction with your kids that way in order to make sure that you're able to see exactly what it is that they're making sure that their camera is able to get exactly what, sorry, I'm trying to read chat questions here at the same time. Not able to multitask here. It's going to make sure that the camera is less likely to move, and you're going to end up with more sharper images that way if you'll take the time to make sure they're holding their camera correctly. And if we were in a workshop, if I had students here and I go out to take pictures with them, I will call someone out if they're not holding the camera correctly, because it really will make a difference. And if they're in the habit of always doing it like this, then you've got to break that habit. And it just takes a little bit of time to, oh, there's the sheep. You'll have to make sure that you get a little bit of that, sort of break their habit of not holding the camera correctly. And it really will make a difference. So some tips here: use the camera strap. All right, don't just let it hang down. Again, I like to wrap it around my wrist, and you'll notice I wrapped it twice. That just provides better security if I do get bumped. Hold the camera correctly, support the weight, and keep your arms in tight to your body. Use the viewfinder, not the screen on the back, because again, if I'm using my viewfinder rather than the screen, that's going to, again, force me to pull that camera in tight to my eye and into my body rather than holding it out here. Even if I'm using a phone to take pictures, I don't want to hold it at arm's length because, again, that provides no stability. So bring your elbows in tight to make sure that you, again, provide as much stability as you can when you're using that phone. It's really helpful if you have a little bit of money and you're trying to figure out some things to spend it on. Make sure every camera kit has an extra battery. You don't want to have your students out shooting an assignment and suddenly their battery dies because they forgot to put it on the charger the night before. So having an extra battery in your bag can really be a great security for getting the pictures that you need. This is another one of my pet peeves. You'll notice I have several of these as we go through here. The card in our camera is not designed for permanent storage. It is designed for us to be able to go out and get the pictures that we need, come in, download them to our computer, and then immediately reformat the card so that we rebuild the directory structure on that card. So you want to get your students into the habit of not leaving pictures on that card for weeks or months on end, but shooting an assignment, then putting that card back in the camera and going through the menu and doing a reformat. You don't want to just do erase all, because that doesn't recreate the directory structure. That card will last longer and be more stable so that you don't lose images or you suddenly can't read anything off the card. So going through that reformat process on a regular basis really will make a difference. Just some buying advice. If you are buying lenses, put a UV or a skylight filter on every lens. And that way it's just going to protect the front of the lens. Fingerprints and things like that are easy to clean off those, and you're less likely to damage the lens, especially if the lens gets hit by something on the front of it. Don't hold a phone at arm's length. And finally, if you are using your phone, tell your kids, make sure that they don't have a bunch of movies and music and everything else or apps on their phone. They need to have some good storage space so that they can get as large an image file as possible. The other thing that we need to just very quickly talk about are our camera modes. So you have 4 basic modes on our cameras. We have auto or program mode, and sometimes those are split into 2 separate options. We have shutter priority, we have aperture priority, and we have manual. And it's important for you to understand exactly what the differences between those modes are, and also be able to explain those to your students as well. If we were looking at Canon or Nikon and we're looking at the dial on the top of our camera, Canon uses the TV and AV mode to designate shutter priority and aperture priority. Nikon and everybody else uses S and A. They mean the same thing. It's just the terminology that the manufacturers have used, and Canon has just always gone with TV and AV. So I'm going to respond to this question real quick from Sarah in the chat. So Sarah, what you need to do is grab like what you would use to open a stuck can or a jar lid that, and use that to try and twist that lens, that UV filter off that's broken. If you can't get it off with that, then get like a jeweler's saw, and with the camera sitting straight up, you're going to saw just the edge of that filter in order to try and break it apart. You may have to saw in several different spots in order to get it off. But yes, that's the great thing about having a UV filter on your lens, is that it will break on occasion, depending on how it's been handled, but you still don't lose the lens. And if you ever do damage the lens with today's cameras, it's just toss that lens in the trash and go out and buy a new one. Most lenses, unless they're a $1,000 lens or more, is probably not going to be worth trying to get it repaired. So there are different camera modes. So you need to understand how to change that dial and why you want to change the dial. And here's a quick sort of little tip on how to determine which mode we want to use. We want to try to avoid the auto or program mode, because those modes let the camera make all the decisions for us. And we want the students to actually figure out, all right, do I need to use shutter priority first, or aperture priority first, or manual? And if I'm using manual, what do I need to set first, my shutter speed or my aperture, so that they're getting the picture that they want rather than the picture that the camera thinks they want. And that's what auto and program mode do. So we want to get away from using those. If you use those yourself, hopefully after this session is over today, you'll be able to quit using that and figure out which one you do want to use. If we're shooting with shutter priority, we're really photographing sports in action, because that shutter is going to let us control motion. So if you're sending your kids out to shoot a football game or a basketball game, and we want to get them off auto and program mode, then we're going to start them on shutter priority, because that's going to let them set the shutter speed that their camera is using. Aperture priority is really everything else that you would have them photograph for your book, because aperture priority is going to give us control over depth of field, which is the area of acceptable focus, what's in focus and what falls out of focus. So sports action, shutter priority, everything else that you would shoot, classroom, clubs and organizations, other events at the school that aren't sports or action, you want your students using that aperture priority mode, or get them into manual. And manual just means that they're going to control both shutter speed and aperture. But back in the day when I first started teaching, it was manual everything. And that's the way that I taught my students, and I've mellowed in my old age. And now it's about, if I've got a brand new photographer and I'm trying to get them to think about composition and lighting and story and all the other things, then if I can take one thing off their plate to make it a little bit easier, then that's just going to hopefully have them come back with better pictures. And so I've mellowed, and again, we'll go into shutter priority or aperture priority as their first attempt at using that digital SLR, and then get them to use manual after they get comfortable and really understand what shutter speed and aperture we're going to do. So you got your two pieces of paper, and I want you to label one shutter speed, and I want you to label the other one apertures. All right, simple enough. Write that at the top of the two. And we're going to start with our shutter speed piece of paper. So you can set the aperture one down to the side. So if we talk about our standard shutter speeds, these are the numbers that you would most likely see on our cameras. And it's pretty quick and easy to see the pattern to these numbers. They're either doubling or they're cutting in half, depending on which direction we move. There's two awkward spots there when we go from 8 to 15 rather than to 16, and we go from 60 to 125 rather than 120. Now, on today's cameras that use electronic shutters, you can very easily find numbers in between these. So you may see, if you're looking on your camera, you may be able to use 320 or 350. All that means is that the shutter is able to sort of bridge that gap between these standard numbers. But if you went back to an old Pentax K1000 or old film camera, you're most likely to see just these standard shutter speeds. And what you need to remember about them is that these numbers actually represent a fraction of a second. So the larger the number, the faster that shutter opens and closes. And we sort of think about the shutter speed like the eyelid on our eye, that when that eyelid is open, we're letting light into the eye. When the eyelid is closed, when we close our eyes, we're not letting any light in, which is exactly what the shutter is doing on our camera. One of the things to understand about these numbers is that as we move, in the same way that we're either doubling or cutting them in half, we're doing exactly the same thing to the light coming into the camera. So when I go from 1/25th of a second to 2/50th of a second, I've halved the amount of light coming into the camera. Now I go from 250 to 500, I've halved it again. So very quickly, as we move a couple of places on this scale, we're going to end up drastically reducing or increasing the amount of light coming into the camera, depending on which direction we're moving. Now, what I want you to do with that sheet of paper is I want you to write down these numbers. And again, if you have lines on the paper, that'll make it a little bit easier. Do it along the edge of the paper. And what that's going to let you do is be able to use this in the little exercise that we're going to do in just a second. So you would do 1, 2, 4, 8, 15, 30, 60, 125, 250, 500, and 1,000, just down the edge of the sheet of paper. You will find, if you look on your cameras, that your numbers, your shutter speeds probably go further in either direction. And so one of the things that you want to do and what you want your students to do, figure out what's the fastest shutter speed that they have available on that camera and what's the slowest shutter speed. Because what you'll probably find, especially if you're in manual mode, when it's a little bit easier to see this, is that you're going to see a B setting, which stands for bulb. And bulb just means that if I set my shutter speed on bulb, that shutter will stay open as long as I keep that shutter release pressed down, which means I could do a minute-long exposure. I could do a 30-minute exposure. I could do a 5-hour exposure if I needed to, as long as I'm using that B setting and using something to hopefully not sit there for 5 hours with my hand on that shutter release, because I'm going to end up vibrating that camera and lose whatever picture I might have gotten because of camera movement. And on the high end, instead of 1,000th of a second, your camera may go to 2,000th of a second or 4,000th of a second, or maybe even 8,000th of a second. You want to have your students identify which cameras have the greatest range, specifically which ones will use the fastest shutter speed or have the fastest shutter speed available, because that's the camera you want to use when you're shooting daytime sports, because the faster the shutter speed, the better we're able to control the amount of motion in the picture. So you've got a daytime baseball game or softball game, identify if one of the cameras that you have in your inventory actually has a faster shutter speed available than one of the other models that you may be working with, because that's not the one you'd want to send with your photographers. And on the other end of the scale, you'll probably see a shutter speed all the way up to 30 and an inch mark. That means it's up to 30 seconds exposure. So built into the standard shutter speeds is anywhere from 30 seconds exposure all the way up to 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000th of a second. And again, some of your cameras may even have 8,000th of a second. So you've got those numbers written down. We understand that each one is a fraction of a second. So the higher the number, the less light we have coming into the camera. So write down next to the two numbers, most light and least light, to be able to figure out exactly, again, just to help you remember what that number represents. Okay. Everybody following along so far? Do I have a thumbs up from everybody? All right. I see a few faces there, so that's helpful. Thank you. So thank you, Celia, for responding in the chat. So that's our basic control of light with our shutter speed. Again, the faster it opens and closes, the less light it's going to let into the camera. But the shutter speed, like I said, also controls motion. So the slower the shutter speed, the more the motion, any movement in our subject or with the camera is going to be picked up by the sensor, and we're going to see that as blur motion within the photograph. Now, blur motion is not inherently bad. There are times when we want to use blur motion to help tell the story. But if we're trying to freeze the action, then we need as fast a shutter speed as we can. But notice there's a balancing game that we play here, because if we're trying to stop the motion, we also have less light coming into the camera. And that's a balancing act that we play as a photographer all the time, is I still have to have the correct amount of light to create a correct exposure, but I'm also trying to get the shutter speed that I need in order to be able to control motion. So what you should have ended up with now on your sheet of paper is shutter speeds at the top, these numbers down the side, and you've written most light and blur motion and least light and stop motion to help sort of designate what those shutter speeds represent. And it should look something similar to that. Maybe a little bit neater handwriting than mine, but hopefully that's what you've ended up with at this point. Are there any questions about our standard shutter speeds and what they represent? All right, thank you, Keisha. So let's jump over. So again, one of the exercises that I would have you have your students do is figure out on each of the cameras that you have, especially if you have several different models of the same brand, what's the slowest and fastest shutter speed available on that camera, so that you designate, again, this is the camera we're going to give to the photographer who's going to go out and shoot that daytime sporting event, to make sure that they've got the fastest shutter speed available for them. And again, you're probably going to find 30 seconds is pretty standard for most of our cameras on the low end, and then or on the longest shutter speed, and then the shortest one probably on today's cameras, most of them go to either 4,000 or 8,000 of a second, but you may have an older model that only gets to 2,000th of a second. So again, you want to make sure that you've been able to figure those out. So let's look at a couple of quick pictures here. So is this an example of a fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed? All right, so Sarah, how do we know that that's a fast shutter speed? What's telling us in the photograph that this is a fast shutter speed? Yeah, because the water is sort of frozen in midair, and it's not completely sharp. You know, you can see, especially around his hand, that there's some blur to the water, but still, it's not this. We can still see those drops of water in the air. So the photographer was probably using maybe 2/50th of a second, maybe 500th of a second, but more likely a little bit slower than that. little aside here, here's something that will help you if your students are trying to photograph at the football game or the soccer game and are having problems stopping motion because they don't have quite enough fast enough shutter speed. You can stop motion better when the subject is moving towards you or away from you than if it's moving past you. So if your students are out shooting a game and they just can't seem to stop the motion, they can't get a fast enough shutter speed, then have them position themselves so that the action of that event, of that sport, is moving towards them, and the shutter speed that they're working with will do a better job of freezing that motion or stopping that motion than if they're trying to photograph them as they're running by them. So compare the previous one to this one. You know, now we've got that motion of the pizza crust up in the air. We've got the movement in his hands. Hopefully what I would, you know, I've seen way too many times when I show this picture and a student goes, oh, we would never be able to use that in our book because it's blurry. That's motion blur. That's not out of focus blur. And there's a difference between those two. Motion blur is perfectly acceptable in our books because we can use that to help tell the story. So don't ever look at a picture and say, don't look at this picture and say, I can't use that, because we can still identify the subject. We can still see his face. We know who that is in the picture. So that motion of the hands and of the pizza crust is perfectly acceptable in terms of the kind of photograph that you might want to put in your publication. All right, aperture. So set the shutter speed piece of paper aside, grab the one that says apertures, and let's talk about these numbers. So these numbers, don't write them down yet, because I'm going to have you do something a little different here. These numbers are our standard apertures, but again, depending on the lens that you have on your camera right now, you may not have 2. You may not even have 2.8. It may start at 3.5, or it may start at 4. But most of our lenses will go up to 22. You have to have some very specialized lenses to have any number higher than 22 on your aperture. And we also call apertures f-stops. They mean exactly the same thing. We can use the term aperture or f-stop to describe these sets of numbers. And you'll often see the number written as an f/ that number. So it may be f2 or f2.8 or f11 is the way in which we often talk about these numbers. And while our shutter is like our eyelid, the aperture of the f-stop is like the iris in our eye, which if we go out into bright sun, our iris is going to, become very small openings so that we don't get blinded by the amount of light coming into our eyes. And if we go into a really dark room, then that iris dilates open to let more light into our eye. And the aperture on our lens does exactly the same thing. We use a very large opening when we need a lot of light coming into the lens. We use a very small opening if it's very bright and we need to control we don't want as much light coming into the sensor. And so these numbers don't necessarily have the exact same relationship in terms of their pattern that you saw on shutter speeds, but there is a pattern here. They're actually doubling or cutting in half every other number. So 2, 4, 8, 16, and 2.8, 5.6, again, 11 is a little odd there, and then 22. So the next number, if it was actually available on your lens, would be f32. And then the next one after that is f45. Again, you're not probably going to see that on any of the lenses that you're working with, but there is a pattern to these numbers. And because I was, a mean teacher sometimes, I actually made my students memorize both the standard shutter speeds and the standard apertures so that they understood the numbers from up here rather than just looking at a sheet of paper and trying to remember what these numbers represent. Just like our shutter speed, the aperture controls the amount of light coming into the camera. And the lower the number, the more light that aperture lets in. So the higher the number, the less light it has coming into the lens. So 22 is a very small opening, while f2 is a very large opening. And that's why it's really important for you to pay attention to that widest aperture you have on the lens. And again, depending on what lens you have, if I have a lens like this, and I also have a lens like this, those lenses may not necessarily have the same widest aperture on them. So this lens may let in more light than this lens does, depending on what camera or what lenses you have in your camera bag. So we're going to look at just a second on how you tell exactly what aperture or what the widest aperture of that lens is. We also refer to that as the speed of the lens. So if you ever hear anyone, or if you hear a photographer talking about the speed of the lens, that just means they're talking about the widest aperture that that lens has available to you. But apertures also control depth of field. And as I said, depth of field is the area of acceptable focus. A great way to understand depth of field, our eyes automatically focus at whatever we're looking at, but our lens doesn't work the same way. It only focuses on one plane in space. So a great way to help your kids understand what depth of field is to have them hold their hand up in front of their face and focus on the palm of your hand. And without taking your eyes off the palm of your hand, notice how the background behind your hand is now blurry. That's really the way our camera sees. It's the way we focus the lens on our camera. And if I look at the background without taking my eyes off that background, my hand is now blurry. What we're trying to do with depth of field is we're trying to extend that area of acceptable focus so that not only can I get my hand so that it's in focus, but I can get that background as well. And we do that by changing the aperture that we're using to try and increase that area of acceptable focus. If you come to my session tomorrow on how to some good ways or some fun ways to teach shutter speeds and apertures, you'll see a little exercise. See, I'm putting in a plug now for tomorrow's session, just to get some of you to show up for that one as well. You'll get some good ideas on how you can help your students understand depth of field a little bit better. So here's the way I want you to write down these numbers. I want you to start, so on your sheet of paper that says aperture up at the top, I want you to start again on the edge of the paper, but I want you to start with 22 and go down. So it's going to be 22, 16, 11, 8, 5.64, 2.8, and 2, going down the sheet rather than up, or starting with the highest number up here rather than the lowest number like we do with shutter speeds. And again, you'll understand why I'm doing it that way in just a second. All right. Everybody got those numbers written down? Give you another 20 seconds here. And again, there are lenses out there that go below 2. You'll find what we call a nifty 50 lens that goes to 1.8 or even 1.4 or 1.2. But the lower that number is a direct relationship to the cost of the lens. The lower that number, the more expensive the lens is probably going to end up being. But there's some advantages to that. All right. So that's what you should now have on your sheet of paper. So 22, 16 going down, and then less light, more depth of field, and more light, less depth of field. Okay. So we need to determine the speed of your lens. So if you will look on your camera for a second, and for those of you that have a kit lens on that camera body, this is what you're probably going to see. You're going to see if you look on the lens, and sometimes it's around the barrel, sometimes it's on the front of the lens. You just have to look and identify where on your lens to find that. You're going to look for a 1 and then a colon and then a number after that. And the example that I've got here on this particular lens, which is a 16 to 85 millimeter lens, is 3.5-5.6. And that's what most of our kit lenses are going to have, is they're going to have a range where there's a lower number, a dash, and then a higher number. And what that range means is that because it's a zoom lens, because we can change the focal length of the magnification of our subject, we're also changing the widest opening on our aperture as we change the magnification on that lens. So on this lens, if I'm at 16 millimeters, which gives me a very wide angle of view, the widest aperture I have available to me is 3.5. But if I zoom in, if I magnify my subject, The widest aperture now is 5.6, which means I have less light coming in through that lens. And if I have less light coming in through my aperture, what do I have to do with my shutter speed to still make sure that I get a correct exposure? So if I have less light coming through the aperture, what do I have to do with my shutter speed to make sure I get a correct exposure? Perfect, Sarah. I have to leave it open for longer. I have to use a slower shutter speed. And if I'm using a slower shutter speed, what's going to happen to that football player running down the field? Exactly, Sarah. It's going to blur. I'm going to pick up the movement or the motion because the shutter is opening and staying open for a longer period of time than 500th of a second or 1,000th of a second. That's what ends up frustrating your kids so often when they go out and they try and shoot a sporting event and the only lens that they have on their camera is a kit lens. They automatically zoom in to magnify the subject as much as they can, and they're immediately losing light from that lens or through that lens, through that aperture. So if you just have kit lenses for them to shoot with, then one of the things that I would encourage you to tell them to do, especially when they're shooting sports, is to not zoom with that lens. Instead, let the subject come closer to them, or they move closer to their subject if they're able to, in order to get the subject as large as possible in the frame and still be able to get as fast a shutter speed as you can. So you work within the limitations of the lens by making sure that you have as much light coming in through that aperture as possible. Or you do like if you saw in the chat earlier where Sarah was asking about the 70 to 200 millimeter lens that she has. You know, the great thing about this lens that I have here for my camera, it's a 80 to 300 millimeter lens, or the equivalent of that because of the size of the sensor in my camera. But it's also, see if I can hold this up here. You can see 1:2.8. That means that throughout the magnification or the range of magnification on this lens, I don't lose light. It stays at f2.8 as my widest aperture, as the speed of my lens, no matter what my magnification is. And that's why at some point, if you're able to save a little bit of money, or you can talk your sports booster clubs into maybe contributing a little bit towards getting a really good lens, you want that 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens, because that's the perfect lens for you to be able to shoot all those outdoor sports with, because you don't have to worry about losing light even when you magnify your subject. And one of the other things that I would tell you to get is one of these lenses. We call it a nifty 50 is the newer term for it. I just refer to it as a 50 millimeter lens. In fact, back when we used to buy cameras for film, this was the standard lens that came with it. We didn't have that zoom lens, that kit lens like you see now. Instead, we'd buy it with this lens. That 50 millimeters means that we see through that lens approximately what our eye shows us. So we're not getting any magnification. We zoom by moving closer with the camera or moving further away. But you'll notice the speed of this lens. It's a 1:1.8. And that 1.8 means that it lets in an incredible amount of light. This is the lens you want to send your students out to cover classroom or event or organization or clubs or events around your school. But it's also a great lens to photograph in your gym for basketball and volleyball, because it lets in so much light through the aperture. We're able to get a faster shutter speed to be able to control the motion in those sporting events. And the great thing about these is that you can get a nifty 50 for less than $200, $150 or less, depending on whether you buy a brand name like Nikon or Canon for your camera, or whether you go with Sigma or something like that. So we want to make sure that we have as much light as possible, and that's what this lens does. And again, it's a great investment. I know schools out there that have put one of these lenses in every one of their camera bags so that the students have access to this lens and this aperture to work with. So look at a couple of examples here. Is this an example of a shallow depth of field or a wide depth of field? Is everything in focus or is only our subject in focus? So this is an example of a wide depth of field. So it's F11 or F16 because not only, and that's actually Jay Dickman in the pool there. So the guy you saw the quote from at the beginning, that's the guy, that's what a National Geographic photographer will do to get the picture that he wants. But both he and the diver and the water tower in the background are all in focus. So we have a very wide depth of field. And you look at this one, typical classroom shot where the teacher, David Knight, is in focus, but the students in the background fall out of focus. That's an example of F2.8 or F4 because it's a shallower depth of field. So here's what you're doing with those two sheets of paper. And we're almost out of time here. So I'm going to make sure that I'm going to hit this pretty hard to make sure that we cover exactly what I want you to do with these. If you take those two pieces of paper and you line up 60th of a second at 5.6, and I'm just choosing that combination right now. If you look at that, all of those other combinations have exactly the same amount of light coming into the camera. So 1/4 of a second at f22 is the exact same amount of light coming into the camera as a 15th of a second at f11, or a 60th of a second at 5.6, or 2/50th of a second at 2.8. Didn't know if I had one more in there or not. Those are what we call equivalent exposures. And that means that we have completely different pictures in terms of the depth of field and the motion, but all of them still give us the correct amount of light coming into the camera. And that's what you want your students to understand, that either shutter priority or aperture priority or manual is all about figuring out what's the equivalent exposure that we want in order to get the picture that we need. And you can see from Katie a note here that if you have questions that we don't have time to get to, please jot them down, and you can go into happy hour this afternoon, or you can even post some questions to me in Attendify, and I will respond to them there. And Kelly, you have a great point there that, yeah, if you're using autofocus, some lenses will definitely lock the focus mechanism. And so you definitely have to be very careful about not having them break the lens because they're trying to force that when it's in autofocus mode. Equivalent exposures are the key to every picture that you take. So making sure that you and your students understand exactly what this means. A great way to play with this is just to line up a different combination. And again, look at the, a great exercise would be to actually have your students go out and shoot the same scene at all 4 of these different settings and be able to see exactly the difference it makes to each of those pictures. And again, you may find if your kit lens doesn't have f2.8, then you're not going to be able to choose that combination from your equivalent exposures because it's not available to you on the lens that you have on that camera. So again, it's a great way to help understand exactly what that does to each of the different settings and the picture that you're going to end up with as you're taking those pictures. All right. Again, 45 minutes is always tough to get through this. I hope this has given you a couple ideas on what you can do in terms of helping understand shutter speed and aperture. Again, join me for happy hour if you have some more questions, or come back for the session tomorrow afternoon where we're going to talk about some fun things that you can do to actually teach these. In fact, Mr. Schmidt is featured in that slideshow. So if you want to see some pictures of how helping explain that to everybody, you can check out the session tomorrow. Any quick questions? All right. Again, thank you guys. Or join me in the next session where we're going to be talking about workflow in Photoshop. And again, thanks for being here.